I'm James McCann. I'm the director ad interim of the Pardee Center, which is one of the hosts for your morning activities if you were the task force. And those of you who've been able to join us for lunch, this represents the meeting of two kinds of things that the Pardee Center does. One, we identify with our colleagues topics of importance that have a way of understanding a longer term, but rooted in basic issues we understand and need to understand today. So if, by way of introduction to the Pardee Center, for those of you who know it, and those of you who are still making that first engagement, let me say the Pardee Center is a place where conversations, research, and discussions take place of a very different nature within the university setting. For example, we can have a group, as is taking place this morning and through the afternoon. Some of you are with this task force, a task force to discuss a future sense of what happens to capital movements globally. Not only what's happening now, but what we can anticipate. The Pardee Center sees itself as also being able to sponsor and draw interest across the globe and across the campus on issues like biological transformations, invasive species, whether they be bacteria, virus, or the movements of plants and animals in a way that affects economic livelihoods, in a way that affects people's own kind of reactions as people who make decisions in their own lives. So a number of different kinds of themes, almost anything that's possible to put in the context of the world. And if you want a sense of that, in the back table here, for our guests, those are complimentary copies of our publications to give you a sense of the range of things that we consider. So having said that, I hope those of you who are either on the Boston University campus or who are nearby or maybe visiting, that you'll come to the Pardee Center down on Bay State Road, and that you will engage with us via our website, and also consider participation by having potential postdoctoral students come to spend some time with us. You yourself to come and help us define issues. And that's one of the unique things that places we occupy within the university, because we are not a department, we're a place that generates and follows through on ideas. It's an amazing phenomenon. So it's been a great pleasure for us to be able to be involved with Kevin Gallagher in setting up this meeting to bring our terrific staff to bear. And again, these are copies of our materials, particularly for our guests for today. So please have a look at them, take them with you, spread the good word about the word of Pardee, the work of Pardee. And let me turn you over to Kevin Gallagher, who's going to speak about and introduce our special guest for the day.
Thanks, Jim. Let me formally welcome all of you today. Today is part of a one-day. This luncheon is part of a one-day workshop that we've been having in the back rooms of the building here, where we've brought together a number of academics and policymakers to examine the impact of short-term capital flows on the long-run development prospects of emerging market and developing countries, and to specifically evaluate the extent to which certain kinds of regulations that had been stigmatized in the past in a post-financial crisis setting or a current financial crisis setting, the extent to which those should be revisited and rethought about to try to prevent and mitigate future crises and help us recover from this one. I really want to thank all the members of the task force to take time out of their busy schedules to come here over the course of the day. But since we have all these exciting people here for the day, we thought we wanted to invite some people from across the campus to engage with these folks and to hear one of the very distinguished people that's part of the task force today to give a more public luncheon. So we got very picky, and we just invited a handful of you. And basically those who are connected to the co-sponsors. Today also doubles. It's it's the beginning of the semester for those of you who are not engaged in academia. So this is the Pardee Center's basic first major event of the semester, and it's also the first major event of BU Global Development. They're a co-sponsor of today's event, today's luncheon. I'm the faculty coordinator for BU Global Development. BU Global Development is a pair of master's programs, one in global development economics, the other one in global development policy, where students study development economics, the political economy of development, development and public health, and environment and development. And then they have to choose one of those tracks to go down in their 2 years here. So many of the students that are here, welcome to all of you. Welcome to BU. This is our first event of the year. Many of you are sitting with students in the Global Development Economics and Global Development Policy program. Welcome to all of you here. Another co-sponsor is I don't even know if we can call it new yet because it isn't fully established, but it's about to be established, is Boston University's new Center for Finance, Law, and Policy. Con Hurley over here is the director. I'll read you their approved mission. The Boston University Center for Finance, Law, and Policy serves as a multidisciplinary unit of BU, engaging faculty and students from across the university in discussions about the national and global financial system. The center will mobilize the resources of a great university to educate, analyze, discuss, and recommend solutions regarding critical financial, regulatory, and policy challenges of the day. So we're really excited about this new center being part of the university. I'm sorry.
It's so new, we don't even have any materials on the table in back, so people are welcome to help themselves to those materials.
There you go. We're going to, the Boston University Center for International Relations and the Center for Finance, Law, and Policy are going to sponsor an event on November 17th that you're all invited to. Jeff Frieden has written a book with Menzie Chin called Lost Decade about the financial crisis and the extent to which there's a recovery. And if you go to the Center for Finance, Law, and Policy webpage or the Center for International Relations webpage, we'll soon have the information about the date and time of that event here. I also want to welcome some of the Humphrey Fellows that are here from the Humphrey Fellows programs, one of Boston University's programs, where we bring folks from other countries to spend some time here and educate us and interact with them. So welcome to all of you, and thanks to the Center for Finance, Law, and Policy, Pardee Center, and the BU Global Development for funding this lunch. So about a third of us today are here for this task force workshop. As Jim said, one of the things that the Pardee Center does, it tries to bring groups of people, academics and policymakers together to look at a current problem or current that might have long-run implications. And so many of us today have been looking at the impact of speculative capital that has been massively flowing from developed countries to developing countries and emerging markets in boom and bust cycles for decades, but is being acutely felt in the wake of the financial crisis now. In the midst of those capital flows, many countries are just doing whatever they can to try to mitigate those flows. And some countries have resorted to a tool that has had a lot of stigma attached to it in the past, and what have been traditionally referred to as capital controls, although many of us in the workshop today think that to be able to think about it in a more enlightened way, we should refer to them as things like capital account regulations or capital management techniques, and the IMF has changed the name of these to capital flow measures. Whatever you want to call them, we are spending the whole day trying to think about what is the appropriate role of capital account regulations, when should they be used and under what context, how do you monitor them, how do international investors move around them and so forth. And something that we'll be dealing with after lunch is the extent to which there should be global cooperation on these things. Because there's been so much interest in capital account regulations over the past couple of years, the G20 and the IMF put together a set of guidelines with the intent to try to help guide some developing countries and emerging markets to make some of the decisions about that. Many of the people in the task force echo the emerging market and developing country governments who have been very critical of this sort of first draft attempt by the International Monetary Fund, and we're spending a lot of day thinking about that. Our distinguished guest today is really at the epicenter of those political debates at the G20 and the International Monetary Fund, and that's Paulo Batista from Brazil. He's one of Brazil's most distinguished economists, and over the past decade or so has been very engaged in Brazilian public policy on international affairs. He's currently the executive director to the IMF, representing Brazil and 8 other developing countries in his region. But before that, he was the Undersecretary for Economic Affairs in the Ministry of Planning. He was Special Advisor to the Minister of Finance on external debt in the Ministry of Finance. And he has a long and distinguished academic career at the Getulio Vargas Foundation. He was a professor, and he was the head of the Center for Monetary and International Economic Studies. He had his economics training at the London School of Economics and in Brazil, and in making economic policy for one of the most dynamic and interesting and engaged countries on these issues on the planet. And so I'm really, for those of you who don't follow this stuff every day, next week is the annual meetings of the International Monetary Fund. In addition to that, there is G20 finance minister meeting to prepare for the G20 meeting. So we're really appreciative that one of the core members of emerging markets engaged in these meetings in the G20 and trying to solve the global financial problems would come to Boston for a day to spend some time with us thinking about this, and then be willing to share some of his insights and thoughts with a wider BU community and to engage with our students. And so I want to welcome and invite Paulo Batista to come here and share some remarks with us. He'll speak for a half hour or so, and hopefully we'll have some good time to engage in questions and answers with Paulo Batista. Thank you very much for coming here.
Thank you, Kevin. I'd like, first of all, to thank Boston University, the organizers and sponsors of this conference, for inviting me here to speak about the IMF, capital account regulations, and developing countries. It's an honor to be here. Let me tell you, first of all, that for me, being here is part of my effort to prepare for the meetings next week. Because as I was telling the group that participates in the task force, they have contributed individually and as a group very much to the understanding of these phenomena which we are discussing today, and which I will give my views on. And in particular, I think they have and they can continue to contribute to break some of the intellectual inertia that there exists in the world and in developing countries and among developing countries officials, where, you know, things are changing and we are recovering a little bit of our confidence. But still, there's a lot of intellectual intimidation or intellectual inertia, as I said, that needs to be broken. And academics with a policy orientation like the ones that are meeting here today really function very much to people like me as a stimulus and as a source of ideas and information. Now, the international crisis of 2008 and 2009, one of the members of the workshop prefers to call it the North Atlantic financial crisis, and he's right, led to a major revision of economic policy recommendations. This revision, albeit unfinished, has affected a large number of policy issues, including, of course, regulation and supervision of financial activities. The previous preference for light touch regulation, the faith in the self-correcting virtues of free markets, have been replaced by a renewed emphasis on the role of governments and central banks in preventing speculative excesses, buildup of risks, and so forth. An important part of this debate is, or should be, the regulation of international capital flows. Prior to the crisis, capital account liberalization was almost an article of faith in some circles, in many circles. The benefits of free capital flows were accepted with no major reservations, and still are, incredibly, by many policymakers and international organizations, and capital controls were stigmatized. This has changed since then to some extent. However, as José Antonio Ocampo pointed out, there's a curious dichotomy in what is now mainstream thinking about this. The need for strong regulation and supervision of financial sectors is generally recognized now, and how could it not be after what happened in financial markets in the US and in Europe? But curiously, this recognition does not extend so much to the regulation of international financial flows. As Ocampo observed, the effort to re-regulate finances largely at the national level, cross-border finance is being left almost outside this effort, as if it did not require regulation, or indeed as if it was not part of finance, he says, and I agree with him. I will come back to this point when I address the hesitant nature of the recognition of the IMF of the need for capital account regulation. There has been a recent shift in the stance of the IMF, but this shift has limitations which I will mention to you. Now, when I arrived in the fund 4 years ago, before the crisis broke out, say around 2007, 2008, the standard approach to the topic we're discussing today was more or less the following. If you're facing, for instance, very large capital inflows, you should adjust your fiscal accounts and let your currency appreciate. Or first let your currency appreciate and undertake at the same time the more difficult fiscal adjustment. In addition, it was suggested to countries that they liberalize or remove restrictions on outflows of capital that they could have in their legislation. That was a message that countries like Brazil and others received from the IMF, for example, before the crisis. Not much more than that. Even international reserve accumulation was frowned upon. For example, Brazil had begun to accumulate reserves in earnest in 2006. This would serve us, as you may know, very well during the crisis. However, I recall, having been present in these missions, that staff of the fund in the annual consultations, the so-called Article 4 consultations with Brazil, in Brasilia, warned Brazil against excessive, what they saw as excessive international reserve accumulation by Brazil. I'm glad that we did not listen to that recommendation. Even at that time, in 2007, 2008, the insufficiency of the standard approach, let the currency rise and adjust your fiscal accounts, was relatively clear, at least to me. In the first place, emerging markets had had ample experience of the dangers of exchange rate overvaluation. A persistently strong currency undermines the economy's international competitiveness and can lead to dangerously high current account deficits. A sudden reversal of capital flows, as often happened, forced economies to undergo very painful adjustment processes. In Latin America, perhaps more than in most other regions, boom-bust cycles driven by international capital movements were an often recurring phenomenon. Second, the recommendation to use fiscal adjustment in response to excessive capital inflows was also very problematic. Fiscal policy is not well placed to respond adequately to large and volatile capital movements. In theory, fiscal adjustments can help you do a strong fiscal adjustment. This allows you to loosen monetary policy, lowering the attractiveness of domestic financial assets for foreign investors. That's the textbook approach to this issue. In practice, however, fiscal policy is slow. It's a heavy and clumsy instrument, difficult to deploy against fast-moving and fickle capital flows. It is always subject to very severe political constraints, requires largely legislative approval, as you know, and also one must bear in mind that fiscal policy has other objectives, and it seems to make little sense to tie it to the fluctuating moods of international investors. Moreover, as has been noted by several economists in recent years, there's what we could call a paradox of strong fundamentals. If you do respond to large capital inflows by adjusting the fiscal accounts strongly, this leads to an increase in an improvement in your fiscal fundamentals, in your public accounts. This can reinforce confidence and lead to further inflows of capital, complicating your situation. The other aspect that was removing restrictions on outflows. That can help somewhat if the domestic investors do take the opportunity to move funds out of the country. It's going to alleviate the pressures on your exchange rate. But at the cost of increasing your vulnerability at a later stage, in times of uncertainty and crisis. If you liberalize outflows too much, this may facilitate capital outflows. So the weakness of the approach that you heard from the IMF and others before the crisis was very evident. Now, after the crisis broke out in 2008, especially after Lehman, the insufficiency of the approach became, I would say, glaring. The wall of liquidity produced by the expansionary monetary policies of the reserve currency issuing countries, the central banks of these countries, first and foremost, of course, the Federal Reserve, but also the European Central Bank, the Bank of England, the Bank of Japan, contributed to create a formidable problems for emerging markets. As you know, we suffered less from the crisis and recovered more quickly. No? We also have higher interest rates on average, especially than what the developed countries have after the crisis. So you had a combination of growth differentials between emerging and advanced countries and GDP growth differentials and interest rate differentials, making for powerful factors to attract capital in that direction. And beyond these cyclical factors, there seems to be, I say seem because you never know and you may get burned, but there seems to be occurring a fundamental reassessment of international risks in favor of emerging markets. That is to say, a reallocation of portfolios that would lead to a longer-lasting increase in the supply of capital to emerging markets. This has positive sides, of course, but many emerging market countries are really dealing with an embarras de richesse, as they say in French. No? Now, right now, at this moment, in these last 2 or 3 weeks, with the situation in Europe getting so much worse, risk aversion has increased, and this has changed somewhat. But the basic panorama in recent years has been the one that I've been describing. So you know that economists have spoken of the curse of natural resources, how the overabundance of natural resources can become a curse for countries. I would say that one could equally speak of the curse of the overabundance of capital flows. And I would even go further. One of the worst things that can happen to a country is to fall into the good graces of international capital markets. Now, there's still a widespread view, maybe not so much among the academics that are meeting today, certainly not so much here in Boston, but among officials of advanced countries, G20 officials, central bank officials, IMF officials, and even of developing countries, there's still a widespread view that capital flows are of great benefit to recipient countries. I was going through my papers before coming here, and I found a speech by Madame Lagarde, who's, as you know now, the managing director of the fund, when she was finance minister of France early in this year. And in that speech, she spoke of the massive benefits of capital flows for developing countries and for the world economy. Now, this view may not be entirely wrong. One can construct a plausible case in its favor, but the least you can say, and it was said this morning, is that the theoretical case is shaky for this view, and I would say that the very least you could say is that it flies in the face of experience, because quite a number of economies have been severely hurt, sometimes literally destroyed by imprudent capital account liberalization and surges in capital flows. One has only to look, for instance, to emerging countries in Eastern Europe for recent examples, or for that matter, for countries inside the Eurozone, the periphery of the Eurozone. Or if you want to look for a country outside the Eurozone and outside the European Union, advanced country, Iceland is an emblematic example of the risks associated to financial and capital account liberalization. Now, if you ask me, I think policymakers in emerging market countries are now very much aware of these risks, at least in Latin America and Asia, where we had the painful experiences. We've become acutely aware of the dangers associated to capital flows and to external debt. I spent all my life as an economist, practically, dealing with the problems related to this issue, domestic and international. On the other hand, I still wonder, we have to be cautious, whether there is not a temptation to enjoy the good times while they last, in the hope that this time it will be different. I don't know how things will play out, but in any case, I see that many countries have been adopting measures to curb inflows and to safeguard against the risks brought by these capital inflows. But the task is far from easy. One alternative is to accumulate reserves, as you know. This has important drawbacks, however. First, costs may be substantial, especially when interest rate differentials are persistently high between the accumulating country and the international financial centers, where the country then deposits its reserves. With very low interest rates in reserve currency issuing countries, US, Euro area, Japan, etc., the remuneration of reserves has been very much lower. Whereas the interest rates in developing countries tend to be higher. This is especially the case in my country, in Brazil, where we have extraordinarily high and chronically high interest rates. If you add to that the fact that often you intervene and currency appreciation continues, you have the loss associated to the strengthening of the currency. So losses incurred by central banks that hold reserves are quite substantial. And further, there's reserve accumulation is another example of the paradox of good fundamentals. Because if you try to hold more reserves to stem a reserve appreciation, you become perceived as being safer. And this attracts further inflows, complicating your life even more. So I think that by now the conclusion is inescapable, that macroeconomic policy, meaning by that fiscal, monetary, exchange rate, reserve accumulation, alone do not suffice to deal with the world of large and fickle capital movements. There is increasing recognition of this, that countries blessed or cursed with overly abundant supplies of capital will be advised to resort to macroprudential measures and capital controls to avoid the stigma attached to capital controls, to the expression capital controls. Words count a lot. We are governed by words. The IMF staff has recently used the expression capital flow measures to try to reduce the stigma. José Antonio Campo had previously proposed that we refer to capital account regulations. This morning we heard a suggestion of capital account management. This is all attempts to use expressions that are at the same time more precise and more palatable than the traditional capital control. But this terminological question aside, let me just tell you a little bit of the history of the recent debate in the fund, a very recent debate. I can't go back too far for lack of time. In 2010, last year, the IMF, partly at the insistence of the Brazilian chair, and I came to regret it, by the way, I will explain why, the IMF belatedly recognized that capital controls and macroprudential measures are part of the toolkit that policymakers can use. This was a welcome step. We were very happy at the time when the fund produced that first staff position note, which several of the members of the workshop are familiar with. And we had, as I said, repeatedly called for a reconsideration of the institution's reluctance to accept that fiscal adjustment plus exchange rate flexibility would not take care of the problems faced by countries dealing with overwhelming capital flows. That said, we were happy, but then we noticed that there was some sort of a pushback inside and outside the institution, and the IMF's recognition really has become somewhat hesitant. No? Last April, we had a very acrimonious, very intense, unpleasant even debate in the fund about a possible framework to guide, Kevin referred to that in his presentation, to guide emerging market countries in the use of capital flow measures. And that was called at the time a possible framework, a first round articulation of the views of the institution. That leaves much to be desired. Developing countries, especially Brazil, were not very happy with what was being proposed. For instance, to give you a flavor of the debate, capital controls were recognized but seen as the last resort to be used after everything else had been tried. They are presented by the IMF as a possible complement and not a substitute for what they call good macro policy. They are recommended as temporary instruments, given that they can be evaded as time goes by. At the same time, and in contradiction to the previous point, a big deal is made of possible externalities or spillovers of capital controls. So there's a lot of logical strangeness sometimes in these discussions, because if capital controls are so easy to evade, why are you so concerned with devising exit strategy, treating them as temporary, pointing out their spillover effects on third countries and so forth? In any case, none of these qualifications seem persuasive to me. For instance, just to give you a flavor of the arguments that we have used, macroprudential measures to influence capital flows and capital controls, when adopted at a relatively early stage of the process, of the cycle, preferably in combination with other tools, may avoid the buildup of problems that become increasingly difficult to deal with later on. Tools that can be used quickly, such as controls, prudential measures, can be instrumental in avoiding the development of such situations that are then difficult to reverse. No? Even in fund staff, there's no consensus on these points that I just briefly criticized. The fund's chief economist, for instance, Olivier Blanchard, a very distinguished macroeconomist with an academic background that you may have heard of him, most of you, observed in June when he summarized the Rio de Janeiro conference on capital flows. Some of you were there. Blanchard said, we should move away from strict policy orderings toward a more fluid approach of using many or most of the tools at the same time instead of this now and that later. This statement by the chief economist of the fund, of course, contradicts flatly one of the features of the framework that we approved at the board with a negative vote of most developing country chairs. By the way, this is how things work. They advance countries together with management of the fund, think of a framework for us. We don't like it, but they impose it on the rest of the board, taking advantage of the skewed voting power that the institution has. So at the time, I told Dominique Strauss-Kahn in the board, if you go ahead with this, I will come public to state my objections to this framework. And they went ahead anyway, and I did come out publicly to point out that we did not agree with this simplistic approach that was being presented to us as a guideline or as a possible framework. Blanchard has also observed since then that spillovers from capital flow measures taken by countries like Brazil or others are not very large. At least the evidence for that is not forthcoming. You have some anecdotal evidence, but no hard evidence. And he has stated that theoretical and further empirical work is badly needed to show that spillovers are really there. No? Insofar as effectiveness is concerned, this is a complicated topic. The experiences of Brazil and other countries seem to show that prudential measures and controls can at the very least moderate appreciation, lengthen the profile of a country's external liabilities, and improve the composition of the capital account. IMF staff, in part at least, has tended to support this sort of preliminary conclusion in their studies of country experiences, including Brazil, Korea, and others. Well, despite the lack of firm knowledge in the IMF staff about many issues, and the lack of consensus in the executive board, as I told you, management went ahead and published and approved this, jumped the gun and approved this possible framework. Does this help? I don't think it does, really. It may be even counterproductive in the end for us. That's why I went public against it. Why counterproductive? Because my perception has been that under the pretext of allowing capital controls in some very limited circumstances, the fund may be seeking in reality to extend its jurisdiction to the capital account. Let me explain this a little bit to you. Under the constitution of the fund, which are called the Articles of Agreement, the IMF member countries as such have no obligation whatsoever to liberalize capital account transactions. Legally speaking, they enjoy full freedom to adopt the regulations on capital movements that they may see fit to adopt. I think this is unequivocally clear from reading the Articles of Agreement, although there's been some attempt by lawyers to interpret it differently. I don't think it's possible. Mind you, what I'm saying does not apply to IMF members that have given up this freedom in part or in total by their membership of the OECD, of the Euro area, or that have signed bilateral investment agreements or free trade agreements with the United States. Because all these conventions and treaties have some larger or smaller restrictions on the liberty to regulate the capital account. Of those cases apart, they are quite numerous now. IMF member countries are entirely free under Article 6 of the Articles of Agreement to adopt controls. This article states, and I will quote from it to you, that members may exercise such controls as are necessary to regulate international capital movements. Under some circumstances, even the fund can require member countries to adopt controls to avoid the use of the institution's resources to finance capital flight. This is exactly what happened in the case of Iceland, a country that was very hard hit by the crisis, had an overblown financial sector, liberalized capital accounts, and had to request financial assistance from the fund in 2008. Capital controls, in the case of the program with Iceland, were an important part of the IMF's program. Now, despite all this, some advanced countries have been calling on the fund to establish codes of conduct for the management of capital flows, and the first step in that direction was this possible framework I referred to earlier, which the board approved against our will in April. No? For example, let me quote one important figure in this debate. President Nicolas Sarkozy of France was particularly blunt about this when he launched the agenda for the French presidency of the G20 in January. France is now president of the G20 and the G8 as well. When he launched the agenda, he made a speech making it very clear that one of his objectives during the presidency of France in 2011 would be to approve a code of conduct. Let me just quote briefly to you, just so you get the flavor of the tone that these countries use when referring to us, because this is targeted at us. No? A code of good conduct, this is President Sarkozy speaking, a code of good conduct, strong guidelines, and a common framework governing the possibility of implementing capital controls where necessary. Look, this is curious, possibility. The possibility is guaranteed fully in the Articles of Agreement. But anyway, where necessary, must define, must, not may, perhaps, no, must define the conditions under which restrictions on capital movements are legitimate, effective, and appropriate. If we agree on these rules, ladies and gentlemen, it will be a major evolution in the doctrine of the IMF to the benefit of emerging countries, which suffer from excessive volatility of capital movements. And he goes on, it's too long a quote, but just shorten it. Expanding the supervision of the IMF to include capital account strikes me as crucial. So Sarkozy has the advantage of frankness. He's explaining what others are less frank in explaining. Expanding the supervision to include these, that strikes me as crucial. In the longer term, France, and I'm saying this now, is favorable to a modification of the IMF's Articles of Agreement to broaden its supervision mandate. Yet if we decide on more coordination, more rules, and more supervision, we then need to decide which organization is in charge of enforcing such rules and conducting such supervision. For France, it's clear, it's the IMF. Yeah. That's why for us it's not so clear, because France and Europe more generally is overrepresented in the fund, and we are underrepresented. Eh? So the Brazilian chair at the fund and in the G20 has been very critical of these attempts. The debate is still ongoing. It's going to go on next week in the annual meetings and in the G20 meetings on the sidelines of the annual meetings. It has lost some of its steam, I'm happy to say. This quote from Sarkozy is from April, I believe. It's from April, yes. And since then, the Europeans and the Americans have other things to do than to worry about the code of conduct for us. In any case, the crisis has overshadowed this debate a little bit. In any case, we still are wary that they may want to spring a surprise on us next week. So we are. This may still be a sticking point next week. In my opinion, you know, it's highly inappropriate and even, I would say, politically unsustainable to attempt to use the fund's skewed voting power, which gives undue weight to advanced countries, to impose their agenda on developing countries that are not willing to face restrictions on their liberty to manage their capital account as they prefer, and as guaranteed by the Articles. There's something of an irony here if you think a little bit. Some of the countries that are now at the epicenter of the worst crisis since the Depression of the 1930s and are still far from having solved their own problems seem very eager to promote the establishment of code of conduct for the rest of the world, for us, including for emerging market countries that are currently dealing with overabundant liquidity generated, well, by the monetary policies of these very same countries. So this is really something that's politically unsustainable. But a lot of things that are politically unsustainable, or seem to be politically unsustainable, go on. One is tempted to say, and I've said that in a G20 meeting, to their displeasure, to the advanced countries' displeasure, one is tempted to say, put your own house in order first, before you start preaching to others again. It seems to me too early to forget that the previous round of preaching by developed countries, deregulate, liberalize, trust markets, etc., ended in tears for them and for those developing countries that followed that preaching all too eagerly. So to conclude, let me just say to you that, Brazilians are not renowned for confrontational stances. We're more into conciliation. But on this matter, we've become very resistant, And one thing that we always remind our colleagues is that capital account liberalization was not part of the IMF's original mandate. As I said, Article 6 of the one I mentioned, Article 6 of the Articles of Agreement, was there from the very beginning. Fortunately, misguided attempts to amend or suppress this article in the late 1990s came to nothing, thanks to the Asian crisis, which erupted right at the moment when the US and other countries were pushing for a change in the articles. At that time, the Brazilians in the IMF, another government, that was more than 10 years ago, 15 years ago, the Brazilian chair at the IMF was among those that opposed the attempt to impose capital account liberalization as an obligation. Brazilians are not also renowned for their consistency, and we do not value consistency very much as a virtue, but we have been very consistent in this matter over time across governments and so forth. Those of you that know the history of the IMF are aware of the fact that the founding fathers of the fund, John Maynard Keynes and Harry Dexter White, had learned, both of them separately, from the acute instability caused by laissez-faire with respect to capital movements in the period between the two world wars. Keynes explained at the time of the creation of the fund that the institution would allow members, I quote, full liberty to control such movements, end of quote. Each country was given the choice to leave all transactions free or to enforce controls. If it chose the latter, Keynes was of the view that governments should be left to discover their own techniques. That was the phrase he used in explaining the agreement that was reached. Keynes and White, the Englishman and the American, were right, I believe. Since the global crisis, the pendulum has swung again away from laissez-faire and towards recognition that strong regulation and supervision of financial activities are indispensable to the efficient functioning of a market economy, and capital movements are no exception to that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that eloquent talk. We now have a good half hour to have questions and answers with Mr. Batista. One logistical note, many of you who are not part of the task force came in through these doors. You can't go out. Kidding. We encourage you to go through the back doors and down the elevator through the back. There's a new event on that side. So for the next half hour or so, we can have some questions. Maybe you could take a handful of them at a time and then answer them. Cynthia and Elaine both have a microphone that we ask you to speak in. One, so we can all hear you, and two, this whole conversation will be on the Pardee Center's webpage, so people around the world can take a look at it too. So even if you are a loudmouth like me, speak into a microphone. And tell us who you are and where you're from.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I'm Daniel Bobchuk from Central Bank of Argentina. I'm a Humphrey Fellow at Boston University. Enjoyed very much your thoughts, and I share most of them. My question is, you said about underrepresentation In what is your time horizon you think that underrepresentation could be changed?
Other questions, anyone?
Thank you very, very much for your presentation and for the broader context it allows us to think in. One of the things that strikes me that I don't hear in these discussions is something that's a little bit closer to the part of the world that I work in, and that is remittances. Remittances are capital flow that very often are means by which very, very small-scale enterprises and even family household livelihoods depend on that flow. I wonder if you could put in the context of the larger international movements of capital, the movements of capital flow to places where they, in terms of their percentage of the movement of money into people's lives. Let's think about Somalia, think about Yemen, think about Egypt. Those flows have a huge influence on the politics. So if you could say something about that phenomenon and how it relates to the very much larger movement, the official movement of remittances and capital flows globally.
Thank you very much. Stephanie Griffith-Jones from the Initiative for Policy Dialogue at Columbia University. I wanted to ask really two questions. One is, you have made such a compelling case, Paulo, for why capital account regulations make sense. Given that the case is so compelling, does it really matter so much that the IMF does not really accept this so fully, although they have moved to an important extent? And can just developing countries not pursue this path of capital account regulation on their own? The other question was that we also discussed this morning: is there not a strong case not only for us to think about capital regulations on inflows by developing countries, but should a country like the United States maybe not consider regulating outflows, which would be beneficial to the US in this current context, as given to the fact that the quantitative easing and other measures the Fed has taken have been with the aim of increasing credit within the US, which hasn't really happened enough, whereas these capital flows going to developing countries don't benefit the developing countries. And wouldn't it be in both countries' interests if such measures were taken also in source countries? Thank you.
Almost all your discussion, which I appreciate very much, has been in the context of the capital flows to developing countries or emerging market countries. But one of the characteristics of the North Atlantic financial crisis was the huge explosion of cross-border capital flows between North America and Europe and between countries in Europe, which is something that the Turner report of the UK FSA had pointed out. And also a lot of the work by staff of the IMF, Milesi, Ferrati and others, that there was really an incredible increase in the cross-border capital flow. Now, in the discussions, are the advanced economies not concerned themselves on what these huge explosion of flows have caused them rather than us?
Well, these are very good questions. Let me start with the one that came from Argentina, the Central Bank of Argentina, on underrepresentation in the fund. It's a large issue, which goes a little bit away from our main topic. I'll try to synthesize the problem. I think the major problem, it's not the only one, is the overrepresentation of most of Europe in the fund relative to the size of Europe in the world economy now. Europe has too many votes, too many chairs in the board, chairs in the ministerial meeting, has the unwritten right to the position of managing director, which is the equivalent to the presidency of the fund, and has also, many European countries are also overrepresented in staff, in key positions in staff. So I always, this is just an aside, but I was always very amazed to see the European leaders, as the crisis worsened in Europe in the last 2 years, call for a European monetary fund. And I said, why, if you already have one here in Washington? But anyway, this is the major gap we have. So to simplify things, the major correction you have to do is to shrink Europe and increase the representation of developing countries, especially those that are growing faster. No? This is a very difficult process because the Europeans fight tooth and nail every inch of the way. They go screaming. No? There was a first step in 2008, quota redistribution. A second step in 2010, yet to be ratified, which will reduce the number of European chairs by 2 and increase slightly the voting power of developing countries as a whole. Brazil, China, India gained considerably, but developing countries as a whole not so much. But we've built into that reform, which is yet to be ratified, some further reforms. The reform of the quota formula, which calculates the voting power essentially. This started 2 weeks ago in the board. And the new revision of voting power, which will happen by January 2014. But everything is very difficult. It's a very, because you see, the fund has become very much more important than it was, say, in 2006, 2007. A lot of money has come in, a lot of decision-making power, a lot of responsibilities. So the struggle for power within the institution has become much more intense. Sometimes too intense. So this is it's a war, you know. It's a war of attrition, like the war in the Western Front of the First World War, you know. Trincheiras, how do you say that in English? I forget now the term. It's a war of positions, trenches, war of trenches. Yeah. But I can't say like that famous novel, Nicht Neues im Westen, nothing new in the West. No. There are some things new. We're struggling to overcome this problem. It takes a lot. By the way, having heard Kevin say, or someone else, I don't know, that this is going to be on a World Wide Web, I have to remember to say that before they start to give me trouble, that everything I said here and will say is of my personal responsibility. It does not reflect the views of the IMF or of the countries that I represent in the IMF board. But anyway, that's number one. Number two, the remittances. This has become a major source of external resources for many countries around the world. A lot, there have been diasporas for a very large number of countries. To give you an example, in the Caribbean, a lot of our countries in the Brazilian chair are from that region. So, for instance, Guyana or Haiti have a large part of their population living outside the country, but the migration of the 20th century and of the early 21st century is different from the one that created the United States and Brazil in previous centuries, in the sense that people do not break their links with the home country so much. And this has led to a flow of funds, very important flow of funds from the migrant workers in Japan, US, Europe, to the Caribbean, to the African countries, to other Latin America. Ecuador is another country in our chair which has a very large population outside the country. So these have become very important sources of funds for many countries, and the crisis in the U.S. and Europe has affected them through that channel, because this has lowered remittances, not as much as predicted, but in some cases quite significantly. Number 3, the question by Stephanie Griffith-Jones, more than one really. Yes, the case is compelling. Does it matter whether the IMF is hesitant in recognizing? Well, Brazil is going ahead and doing whatever it wants, as you know. Maybe not as much as it should, but quite a lot. And this derives from the fact that we don't need to ask the IMF for any money, any support, partly. No? But there's a different dimension to this, which is the fact that ideology matters a lot, and ideas matter a lot. And the fund is a producer of ideas, of practical ideas, or not so practical, ideas about economic policy making. Eh? So officials around the world, even in developed countries, sometimes listen to the fund. And emerging market countries, quite a lot, you know. A lot of our officials are trained in the U.S. or trained in Europe, mostly in the U.S., in the case of Brazil and Latin America. So we start off by being influenced by our teachers. Everything that's said, that's written in English acquires a special importance. Then we go back to our countries to teach or to work in the central bank or to work in the finance ministry. And we gradually are overcoming this. But there is a reluctance to break with what is seen as respectable in U.S., in Europe, you know, mainly in the U.S. Now, the crisis has created a lot of havoc, you know, and disorientation, because you told us that, not you, I mean, the U.S. and Europe told us that the best practices were what you were doing, and best practices led to a major confusion. So people in the countries like Brazil that are very linked, attuned to the messages that come from the U.S. and Europe are now in a state of shock, and they lost their references. Huh? And so we can, more than before, we can pursue our own policies. But again, I would like to remind you that this applies to countries that have not given up their legal liberty to do so, have not signed free trade area agreements with the U.S., have not joined the OECD, are not part of the euro area, have not signed bilateral investment agreements with the U.S. I know that some of you that are here present signed that letter to the Secretary of the Treasury, you know, appealing for a revision of those provisions in the bilateral treaties of the U.S. And I would like to know how he responded to you. But anyway, that brings me to the other point you made, which is, would the U.S. be willing to consider regulations on outflows to improve the efficacy of its own monetary policy? At a macro level, this seems to make sense. Whether it's feasible, I'm not sure. What I can say is that having listened to the U.S. officials in these last years, in the fund, in the G20, I doubt very much, very, very much, whether they're ready for that. Maybe they'll have to suffer more to be able to come to accept that sort of policy prescription. And finally, the issue that was brought up by the last speaker, which is that the cross-border flows have been destabilizing for advanced economies too. Cross-border flows in the North Atlantic and within advanced Europe. Now, the amazing thing about this is that when the fund or the G20 or these countries, the advanced countries, refer to the crisis, they rarely makes explicit the role that international capital flows played in these crises, in the buildup of risks. It's a blind spot, really. The issue is more or less papered over. So I think that they're not really attuned to that, or they want to make believe that they don't want to deal with that. It's the force of inertia and ideas, but it's also the force of what Professor Stephanie Griffith-Jones was saying this morning, the force of political economy factors, the strength of financial sector lobbies in these countries, in not Europe, US. And this makes the resistance to this sort of recognition very much larger than you would think by looking at the data, looking at the recent experience.
I think we have time for just 2 more questions.
Yes, good afternoon. My name is Marvin Williams. I'm a Hubert Humphrey Fellow representing the Twin Island state of Antigua and Barbuda. We have just spoken about capital controls in dealing with the sort of macro issues and trying to correct the global financial crisis. At the micro level, I'm particularly concerned about flows that have generated as a result of the emergence of the electronic transfer platforms that we have, the mobile banking and the different applications. Within the jurisdictions of that you represent at the fund, how has the supervisory framework changed or would emerge in trying to deal with those sort of challenges that naturally e-commerce, e-banking would create for these countries?
Hi, Nicholas Lave. I'm a student here at BU. So independent of the case for capital controls, I was wondering if you could expand upon coordination problems of implementation in that depending on who implements what policies when, there could be regional vulnerability or exposure to volatility in the short run.
So first on the question about Antigua and Barbuda, Antigua is not in our chair in the fund, but we have some countries in our chair that share some of the concerns that Antigua has. The framework that was approved for capital movements, for capital account management, does not refer at all to the problems of smaller countries. It's mainly focused on emerging market countries, or a subset of emerging market countries that have open capital accounts, like Brazil, Korea, Mexico, Chile, Colombia, and so forth. So there's a blind spot there, I would say. This is a complaint that I've been hearing from some of my Caribbean authorities. For instance, Trinidad and Tobago is very concerned with that. Guyana and Suriname too, not necessarily because of their own problems, but because of what is happening in the Caribbean. Problems such as the one you mentioned are simply not addressed. The fund and the bank, I think that applies to the bank too, the World Bank. They have their focus on the advanced economies, on the emerging market, and for low-income countries. But there's a group of countries that are not low income, but are sometimes middle income or high middle income, but very small and very vulnerable to financial shocks, to climatic shocks. And one of the things that we're going to attempt in the board of the fund, we have started that already at the request of our governors from Trinidad and Tobago, Guyana, and Suriname, is to put the issue of small states, vulnerable small states, not only from the Caribbean, but also from other regions, in the map of the institutions, because they form a group of countries that have specific problems. You mentioned one of them, that need to be addressed in some way. We have to bring in the other chairs that have countries with this profile, Canada, for instance, Australia, and others, and do a joint effort to. In reality, the truth is that smaller countries are often neglected in these large institutions, and their problems are not adequately treated. Now, on the last question about coordination, I'm not sure I understood very well what you're driving at. My experience has been all my life that coordination of policies among sovereign countries is more rhetorical than real. It's something that everybody pays lip service to, but really rarely happens. We're seeing that even the Europeans were thought to be the example, the prime example of success in regional coordination, have immense troubles when hard times hit, immense troubles to coordinate. So what is happening in practice is that the measures that are being taken at the national level with, I think, little coordination, or no coordination, I would say. But have I understood your question correctly?
So I was more asking whether if, if certain countries implement capital controls, there could be short-run problems in that, say, I implement some controls and my neighbor doesn't, there could be these flow issues that explosion volatility. What are the implications to those? So coordination might be a hard problem or maybe impossible in practice, but there could be a case for the need for coordination.
No, that's an important point. That's one of the issues that's been discussed quite intensively. The question is this: if Brazil blocks capital flows, and what happens to other countries in emerging market countries? Will they suffer from the fact that Brazil does not allow capital to come in, so the capital will flow to them? This is a big deal has been made about these so-called spillover effects. But we've been saying that for years in the fund now. Even before I arrived, the Brazilian chair was saying that. Where's the evidence for that? The evidence that measures taken to contain capital flows provoke significant problems in other countries. And so far, no evidence has been produced that this is relevant. Only anecdotal evidence, no hard evidence. The fund, we were informed by staff that the fund is working on this and that they hope to uncover some effects. I commented, the use of the word hope in this context is a bit strange. But anyway, there is this ongoing work to identify, you see what the prior here would be. Let's see if these spillover effects are insignificant, because if they are, this justifies imposing a framework on countries that wish to adopt. But we have been presented with no evidence whatsoever of any sort of spillover effects from policies taken to manage capital accounts. That may still appear, but it hasn't happened so far.
Thank you so much, Paulo. Mr. Batista, could you, all of you, help me in thanking Mr. Batista for coming here?
Thank you.